All right, so let's get started. Hello everyone, my name's Tim Noetzel, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how to become a freelance developer. But since we've got a relatively small session today, I'd love to just ask everyone, are folks already freelancers? Any folks working at agencies?
I used to be.
Okay.
I work full-time at
Nice.
Awesome.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So for some of you, we'll probably cover a few things that you know already. I've got a very deep deck of appendix slides. If you guys want to get more advanced, excited to chat through that stuff as well. Just a teeny bit about me and why I'm actually qualified to talk about any of this. I am a full-time freelance developer. Have been doing freelance consulting for about 4 years. Mainly front end for e-commerce and tech startups, and I also coach devs on going freelance at freelancegps.com. And freelancing has been really good to me. I spent the last year traveling around the country and various parts of the world with my wife, all while working about 30 hours a week and making substantially more than I ever made in a full-time position. So that has been fantastic, but it hasn't always been this way. 4 years ago, I was between startups and honestly pretty burnt out. While I've been a developer informally since I was 10 years old, I had never had a formal development role. I was pretty introverted and I was a sales novice. Now, why do I bring all of this up? It's because I deeply believe that every developer can freelance. It doesn't matter if you're a seasoned dev, you've spent 20 plus years in the industry, or you're a little bit newer, and it doesn't matter if you're extremely extroverted, love talking to people, or you're a little bit more shy and reserved like I am. There are ways to do this that can work for you, so if you take nothing else out of the talk, I hope it's that. Every developer can freelance. You really just need the right plan. And we'll talk about that plan in a minute. But if you're thinking about freelancing, whether full-time or moonlighting, you're probably already thinking about some of the benefits, right? Freelancers get to work when they want, where they want, on what they want, and there's no income cap, right? The more effort you put in, the more you can get out of it. But there are also some challenges, things like juggling multiple clients, doing that whole sales and marketing thing, which many of us developers kind of struggle a little bit with, and competition. In fact, a recent study by the folks at the Freelancers Union actually revealed that the majority of workers in the US are going to be freelancing by 2027. When I saw this, I was pretty skeptical, so I went and I did some digging, and it turns out that that's actually true, even for developers, which is a little bit crazy. And the bigger thing that's kind of shocking is that we're actually well ahead of schedule on this. The study was released before the pandemic, which has substantially accelerated things. So it's getting a little bit crowded. And that means if you're serious about this, if you want to enjoy some of the benefits of freelancing, you really do need the right plan. So what does that look like? Well, I think it's helpful to start with some key questions, right? Who should I work with? How will I meet those people? How do I sell to them? And how are we going to work together? And getting the answers to these questions is actually extremely important if you want to set yourself up for success. If you have good relationships with good clients, things go very, very smoothly, right? Good clients pay well, they communicate clearly, they treat you like a partner, and they even refer business your way. But if you've got bad relationships or bad clients, not so much. Bad clients can pay poorly. They're constantly doing things that make your life miserable, like changing the scope last minute. They treat you like a code monkey or an hourly employee, and your life really becomes a grind. So this is something I really encourage everyone to think about well in advance of starting, or if you're already freelancing, to think critically about on an ongoing basis, right? Choose deliberately who you're going to work with. It makes a huge difference. So I think that, accordingly, there are 4 things that you can do to really kind of set your business up so that it grows and succeeds and works for your life. Identify your ideal clients, pick a marketing channel, plan your sales process, and set yourself up for success by doing a couple of things that we'll talk about. So let's dive into each of those one by one, starting with what is an ideal client. And I tend to think that ideal clients have three things in common. They are quick and easy to sell to, they're easy to work with, and of course they can afford to pay you well for your work. If you think about it, these are pretty obvious, right? As a solopreneur or a small agency, you don't have tons and tons of time to spend selling. And let's be honest, we're developers, right? So we may or may not love selling. We really want to focus on building cool shit. And so you really want to choose clients who are going to make that part of your business relatively easy. By the same note, you also want folks who are easy to work with. Some of that is just treating yourself with respect by only choosing to work with people who treat you well and who you enjoy working with, but some of it is also choosing clients who are well informed, who are going to ask smart questions, give good feedback, who you don't have to do tons and tons of hand-holding with, because that's going to make your life substantially easier than working with clients who really just aren't all that well informed. And finally, of course, you want folks who can afford to pay you well for your work. So there are a ton of clients who can check all of these boxes. And what I'm about to show you is by no means a hard and fast rule. But I have found that tech startups and e-commerce companies, especially those between 5 and 150 employees, tend to do this really consistently, right? There are definitely smaller companies, so they tend to be fairly fast and easy to sell to, right? They tend to be fairly decisive. You don't have to get 50 people to sign off on something to close a sale, so you can typically close, one of those deals in a matter of weeks, if not sometimes days, which is very, very nice. They also live and breathe technology just by the nature of what they do, which means they're generally speaking pretty well informed. Even if you're working with a stakeholder who's, say, from marketing, right, they're going to be pretty knowledgeable about general standards around the web or around whatever that software focus that you're focusing on is, which means you're not going to have to hold their hand through every little thing. They're going to be asking smart questions, giving good feedback, and really collaborating with you, which is just a fantastic way to work. And finally, because they are over 5 employees, that typically means they are either cash flow positive or they have funding from somewhere, which is a nice leading indicator, at least, that they can afford to pay you well. So these tend to work well. Again, not hard and fast rules, but I've found success with it. As folks I coach have found quite a bit of success there as well. Fortune 500s and mom and pops can be a little bit more challenging, right? If you don't have direct, connections into Fortune 500 and you want to sell in, good luck. I would love to hear how you do it, but I think for most folks, right, you're gonna end up spending months, in some cases years, trying to build those connections and sell in. Or if we're talking about a Google or a Facebook or those folks who do tend to hire outsourced developers in certain situations, you're really going to be much more of a hourly contractor, which means you're not going to end up getting all of those benefits that many folks who freelance hope to get, right? That freedom and flexibility and ability to choose what they work on. Mom and pops, on a slightly different token, may be less well informed than some of their technology counterparts. It's obviously not true of every one of them, but I typically don't expect the owners of pizza shops to understand responsive web design, as an example, right? And many of them can't afford to pay you quite as well. So you may have some challenges there. And so what I really recommend is just think about these things critically as you're planning who you're gonna go after, because they make a huge difference. Now, once you've identified your ideal clients, how do you actually meet them? Well, I think you can think about any marketing channel, and this applies to a whole bunch of other contexts as well, but any marketing channel on a couple of spectrums. And the first one is how crowded is that channel, and conversely, how much trust is there, right? Does the channel tend to have lots of other folks using it, whether it's other freelancers or other service providers, trying to reach the same people you're trying to reach, and as a result, your clients have to put sort of their filters up and try to hunker down and avoid all of the constant bombardment of messaging, all of the people kind of trying to manipulate or trick people, or is it a relatively uncrowded channel, and as a result, they're more likely to be open to a conversation, maybe a little bit more trusting. That can make a huge difference. Similarly, how much time does the channel take to use? How much money, how much effort, both upfront and on an ongoing basis. So I've gone ahead and charted out a few common channels that I often hear folks recommend to new freelancers. And let's just go through them one by one, starting with cold outreach. I'm sure everybody sitting here and everybody on the live stream is bombarded with spammy emails and calls and text spam every single day. And so I don't have to spend too much time convincing you that it's annoying, but it's probably important to note that the average response rate for a cold email or a cold call is less than 1%. That's not even getting to the average close rate. So it's not especially effective, but it's also not even that time efficient. You think you're saving a bunch of time, but actually what you end up doing is fighting spam filters, trying to avoid running afoul of different regulations like the Can Spam Act. It actually can end up being quite a bit of work. So I definitely don't recommend it. If it works for you, I'm curious to hear what you're doing, but that's definitely not my first choice. If you look at freelancing sites, for example, you'll see, a little bit better on the trust spectrum, but they are just ridiculously competitive. The average gig on Upwork gets well over 50 proposals with an average price for, and this is for, programming jobs, of less than $20 an hour. And you'll see people in some cases submitting proposals at about $5 an hour. So if you're hoping to build a business that supports your life, at least in the US or Europe, that's probably not a great bet for you. But the trust factor is also pretty funny here. It's like I said, I think a little bit higher trust than cold outreach, but it's still remarkably low. So much so that Upwork even has a feature where they will take screenshots of you doing your work every 6 minutes because they have found that makes clients trust the portal enough to actually book. So not a great foundation, in my opinion, for having a fruitful partnership-based relationship. Social media and blogging, I think again you're moving further up on the trust spectrum. It's a little bit ironic though, because if you're doing social or blogging, in addition to all of the time commitment of doing that, right, 6+ months of setting up the blog and getting traction on it, you're effectively competing with every content creator on the internet, whether they're in your vertical or elsewhere, right, for your client's attention. So I think it's a pretty challenging and inefficient channel for the purposes of freelance development. Definitely some folks have traction with it. Similar story with something like open source, which, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge proponent of open source, but not as a marketing channel, right? Do it because you want to contribute to the community, not because you're hoping that you publish a line of code or two and someone's going to suddenly find you and be like, yeah, that's our person, we're hiring them. It's, it just does not seem to happen that way very frequently. So the question then becomes, well, what is a fast, efficient, high trust, uncrowded channel to meet clients. And the one that I have found works just extremely consistently is one-on-one conversations, right? Just building relationships with members of the community and eventually your clients by talking to people. And ideally doing it one-on-one. And there's a few things you can do there that even if you're kind of more introverted like I am, make it just much, much easier and more comfortable and more natural. So let's talk about that one-on-one conversation strategy and how it actually works. And I think the key question to ask yourself here is who already knows my ideal clients and can potentially introduce me. And these tend to be collaborators, right? Folks who work with your clients already and don't compete directly with you. So for developers, those are often marketers and designers. Often, marketing and design freelancers, but also other folks in the industry. They already know your clients because they're working with them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business or they're working at them. And so, joining marketing or design industry groups, whether online or in person, connecting with other freelancers on LinkedIn, tapping your own network, any designer or marketer that you've worked with in the past at previous roles can be extremely effective. Of course, you can also go to conferences and meet folks there, but I really recommend you think first and foremost about those people who are just very complementary to what you do rather than competitive. They've got the access that you need, and they need access to the types of things you do. So it works extremely well. So once you meet those folks, what do you actually say to them? This is not like a secret magic formula. Effectively, what I recommend is just informal one-on-one conversations, right? Explain your business, what you're trying to do, ask for advice. If it's, from other freelancers, ask for feedback on what's worked well for them and what hasn't. If it's somebody at a potential client or somebody in industry, you can ask questions like, what have you found works well when you've worked with freelancers in the past, but just get some advice for them. And there's two reasons for this. One of them is, the sort of obvious that it's just a lot softer than trying to pitch somebody. But the other one is you actually really do want those different perspectives. People have great things to share. And some of the best insights I've ever gotten into this process have come from folks, who just shared something in a really informal conversation. And then finally, ask for introductions, right? Who else can I talk to who can give me advice, right? Not, who's got a job for me, but just who else can I talk to who can give me advice? You don't have to pitch here at all. If they have a need for your services or they directly know someone who has a need for what you're offering, they'll just tell you because they need it and they want it, and they'll make it pretty easy for you. So it's a nice sort of soft way to kind of get started there. So once you've met someone, or been introduced to a potential client, how do you actually go about making the sale? And actually, before we talk about that, one thing I do want to share is just some metrics around this. I've found that if you have somewhere between 5 and 15 conversations, you will typically meet a potential client who's looking for exactly what you do. So it's ridiculously efficient when you compare that to, say, Upwork, where the average advice is to be submitting 50 to 100 proposals a week, which is, if you want to have any hope of doing that in a way that's the proposals are any good, is a probably 25 plus hour commitment. We're talking about somewhere between 3 and 10 hours of conversation, and you get a really high quality partnership type client out of it. It's just remarkably efficient. So how do you take that client from a prospect to someone you're actually working with? Well, philosophically, I think the first key here is to think about the sales process, not as you pitching or anything else like that, but just co-designing the project. Your goal is to help them make an informed decision, right? Is the project even a good idea? What are the major constraints? What are the major questions you'll need to answer together? What's the range of likely prices they're going to get if they talk to other providers? And how should they evaluate those? And number one, I think giving them this level of information is just an ethical way to work. But from a sales process standpoint, it also substantially increases the amount of trust that folks are going to place in you because you're being candid with them. It's remarkably disarming in a sales process when someone actually tells you the truth and tells you some things that might not be, in their own best interest. So I really recommend doing it. It's been fabulously helpful, and again, I think it's just an ethical way to work. Second point here is to never offer a take it or leave it proposition, right? You are co-designing the project, which means you want to give the client as much sort of say as possible in what that project might look like. What's the scope? How are you going to work together? Those types of things. But you also deserve a say in that, right? You don't have to take a scope that they sort of just throw over the wall to you and say, okay, like this is absolutely what I have to do, and if I don't do it exactly this way, I shouldn't even bother starting the project. You can effectively have a conversation with them, and we'll talk about how to do that in more detail in a minute, but you can have a conversation with them about that scope, and the point is to come together to build a mutually beneficial relationship here. So I think a lot of freelance devs, when they're starting out, really miss kind of this key and tend to either go too far in one direction where they're like, okay, I'm building and designing the project this way, or they just take the client's scope and run with it. You really should be giving them feedback about the constraints and the different decisions and what's likely to happen, what are they sacrificing if they do it a certain way. And then finally, share your network. And I do this in a couple of ways. One of them is just offering to make introductions to designers and marketers and other folks who I'm collaborating with. It's a great way to pay it forward with the folks that you're hoping will send you business. But I also offer in pretty much every conversation I have with a potential new client to introduce them to other developers if I'm not the right fit. And again, I think this is incredibly disarming, but it also seems to pay quite a few dividends in the long run. I've had clients who weren't ready to work with me when we first talked, come back to me and say, we wanted something much more simple, but now we're ready for you. Let's work together. And at that point, they don't interview anybody else. They don't have any other conversations. Like, that's a sale that I've got in the bag. I've had folks who I've passed on to other developers refer me work. So it's just, I think, a great way to pay it forward, which I've never found hurts anything whatsoever. The second key here is to focus on the business problem, and I think this is nice. I've had a bunch of folks do the heavy lifting of explaining this earlier today, and you've probably been in a few of their talks. But I really want you to think of yourselves as artists first and foremost. Code is your medium, right? But your art is solving problems for your clients, right? Code is just your clay, your paint and canvas, your paper and charcoal. And those problems tend to be things like increasing revenue, decreasing costs, or getting traction. So let's talk a little bit about how to do this and apply the last principle through the sales plan. So 9 times out of 10, your sales process is going to start with a call or a conversation. Doesn't matter if it's a video call or whatever else. You have really 3 jobs to do on that first call. The first is uncover the business problem behind the project, right? What are they really trying to accomplish? So let's say, for example, that you're working with an e-commerce company and they come to you and they want a redesign and rebuild of their site. The first question is why, right? Are they looking to do this because their current site isn't converting very well and they're leaving a bunch of money on the table because customers are unhappy or getting confused or aren't convinced that they should buy the product? Is it because their current site is really challenging for the marketing team to update and maintain, and so it's costing them a bunch in time, money, and resources? Are they trying to increase revenue or decrease costs, or is it something else? So you really want to understand that, and I think a lot of folks tend to do this a little bit intuitively, but I recommend that you be very intentional about it. And if it's not 100% obvious, just point blank ask them. So it sounds like you're saying that the business problem you're trying to solve is this, is that right? Get that confirmation. And then once you have it, you want to start to quantify the upside for the client, right? What's in it for them in a future happy, successful state where this problem is solved? So let's say the problem is that first example, right? The e-commerce company is looking to increase their revenue by increasing their conversion rates. Your first questions are, okay, well, what's your conversion rate today? And what's your monthly revenue today? And I'll use some round numbers to make the math easy. Let's say they're making $1 million a month and their conversion rate is a, pretty measly 1%. This, by the way, is exceptionally common. I see it all the time, even though the industry average is, the hand wavy one is 2%, right? You'll find the vast majority of e-commerce companies are actually under that because the average being pulled up by a small number of companies who have conversion rates of 30%. So, right then and there, if you're able to increase their conversion rate to that, 2% average, right, you will have doubled their revenue in perpetuity. That is a pretty big deal. And none of this is a guarantee that that's going to happen or anything like that. It's really just a conversation about what's in it for them in that future state. And gathering that information and giving them that feedback does a couple of things. Number one, it starts to change the way your client or your potential client in this case is thinking about you, right? It starts to push them to think of you as a partner rather than, a code monkey. And it also starts to shift how they think about the project from an expense, right? Something they want to minimize to an investment that they're interested in maximizing. So it makes a huge difference both in terms of how much you can charge, but also in terms of your sort of quality of life as a freelancer, right? They're going to tend to take your feedback. They're going to be more collaborative. So it's really, really helpful. And the last thing you want to do on this first call is identify their budget. Now, oftentimes this happens somewhat organically because you'll be going sort of through the scope and the things that your client wants to build, and they'll say, okay, how much is this going to cost me? And when that happens, I invariably answer that question the same way, which is to say something along the lines of, well, I've done projects like this for as little as 10K and as much as 100K, and the difference is going to depend on what we decide to build together. But my goal is to help you hit your goal of increasing conversion rates, right? Focus on the business problem, by designing a project together with you, co-design the project, at a budget you can afford. So let's talk about what your budget is. And 9 times out of 10, they will just give you a number or a range of numbers. If they don't, ask. You do not want to be guessing on price. And yes, you can expect that a small handful of clients will kind of try to lowball you or that kind of thing, and you can build that in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you don't want to be orders of magnitude off, because that either means you're leaving tons of money on the table, or you've come in so high that you scare them away. You would be surprised how few clients are even willing or comfortable negotiating. If you're off, they're just going to run the other way and go talk to somebody else. It's surprising. So you really want to have a good understanding of what they're trying to do and how much they feel like they can spend on it, because then you're not negotiating nearly as much on price anymore. You're negotiating on scope. And as long as that, price point is within reason, you can usually expand or contract the project to make it fit so you're still making enough where you have a high effective hourly rate. And that just substantially increases the odds that you're going to close the sale. So your last job actually on that topic is to get a call scheduled to go over a proposal. Always do that on that call if you can, because it keeps the momentum of the sale going. And then you'll put that proposal together. So I typically, schedule that call for somewhere between 3 days and a week out. Give myself enough time to put the proposal together, maybe ask a couple of follow-up questions over email. And that proposal effectively needs to do two things. Number one, you want to highlight the problem and the upside that you identified earlier, right? Why are they here? What's the happy future state they're trying to reach? That really just reinforces that you've understood them, and that you can, help deliver the results that they care about. It's also a great way to make your fees seem substantially smaller, because you're comparing it to that big upside. So it's pretty effective. And then number two, you want to offer some options. And I can't stress this enough. It's still a conversation at this point. And I really recommend letting your clients know that pretty explicitly. Hey, I'm going to be taking you through some options today, but these aren't, take it or leave it propositions. If none of these look right, we can put together something totally different. So that's what you're going to do on that second call, right? Is just review that proposal. And your job then is to settle on the scope and the price. And by the way, sometimes this takes more than just 2 calls. That's okay, right? But the rest of the calls are going to tend to sort of be around that notion of settling what the scope and the price are. So you're going to have conversations about that, get to a place where you're excited about it, where they're excited about it. And then you really just need to agree on a few next steps, right? What's the exact scope? What's in and out of scope? How are they going to work with you? How are they going to pay you? Typically, these are documented in what's called a statement of work, which focuses on all the details that are specific to the project. And then I also send over a master services agreement, or sometimes the client will have one that they prefer to use, that covers all the boilerplate legalese, things like non-competes, non-disclosure, who owns the software that you develop. Spoiler alert, it's them, at least 9 times out of 10. But you really don't have to do too much at that point beyond that to close the sale. Finally, let's talk a little bit about setting yourself up for success. There are a few things that you can do up front to set yourself up for success. Many of these are done in the statement of work and in the sales process, right? Always agree ahead of time on how often you'll meet. As developers, we need to be pretty jealous guardians of our time, and making sure that you're going to have that heads down time to actually code and focus on the project, and that you're not going to be constantly bombarded with calls and Slack messages is huge. So agree on that ahead of time. All of my statements of work have something to the effect of, we're not doing more than X number of calls per week. And it's made my life substantially happier. Agree on who's responsible for what, right? If they have to provide assets or a license to a piece of software or whatever, make sure that that's outlined in detail, and obviously what's in and out of scope. If you do these things consistently, you are setting clear expectations for your clients. 99+% of the time, you're going to have 0 issues on the project in terms of client management. If you don't, it's much more of a toss-up. So I really encourage you to do that ahead of time. If you're a developer who thinks the way I do, at least, you would much rather spend your time solving difficult problems in code than solving difficult people problems. And this is a recipe to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then finally, you want to automate and streamline as much as you can. None of these are testimonials for any of these specific products. They're just the ones that I happen to use. I use Calendly for meetings to avoid a bunch of the back and forth of scheduling meetings. All of my clients know if they need to meet with me, they can just look at my Calendly. I automate invoicing for all of the companies that I have retainers with by using Harvest. And then I use a tool called Loom to record videos for asynchronous feedback. So if I need to take a client through a feature I've just built, I don't always have to set up a meeting with them. I can just record a video and send it to them. So that is pretty much it. If you are interested in learning more about this and going, much deeper into how to set up a sustainable freelance business, I've got a free course at freelancegps.com. And beyond that, I'm just happy to take any questions anyone might have.